and we'll talk about Capstone and kind of like go over it. So just give me a thumbs up. Who's looked at the Capstone section so far in the curriculum? Just like, this is the README for the project. Okay, I see a couple thumbs up. Okay, I see a couple people, no thumbs. You haven't looked at the section yet? Okay, all right. So technically, officially, right, I have on the calendar that we start Capstone next week. So just kind of knows like, oh, even if you haven't read it, that's perfectly fine. I would strongly suggest just looking at the README section, just so you can like, even if you're behind in the material, you need to do some catch up. It'll be useful for you to just know the idea of what the capstone is going to be like and kind of what's expected. So no, basically going here on forward, there isn't any new curriculum material that you have to go off of. Basically, what from now it's like January 15th until January 28th, which is our expected graduation date. That's just all the time dedicated for you to work on your capstone project. And so all the, what's it called? All the study groups that we normally have like during this time, we will instead have it as more like office hours. So you can bring your stuff, you know, basically the kind of like an extended one-on-one, right? Because similar to how we've been doing project weeks. But I highly encourage you, especially because there's just such a huge amount of time. That's about a month and a half, right? Of just like working on a project. It's very, very easy to kind of just like get a little lost in how much time it takes and stuff like that. And kind of like, this is, to be honest, this is where I tend to see students a lot of times like kind of fall away a little bit and kind of like forget about the program. So I would highly recommend, you know, make sure you take that time to come to study groups, right? And, you know, ask questions and just bring in, even just kind of bring in your stuff, say, oh, this is what I have so far. We can talk as a group. It's kind of cool also, like, as you guys see what each other are doing, kind of be able to help each other out. For example, one cohort I have, three of them are all doing NLP projects. And so they're kind of like able to kind of talk in that same language and they're asking similar questions and stuff like this. So that's the stuff I kind of encourage you guys. And then if there's something specific, like you're like, hey, like, can we go over this specific topic that we didn't really go into detail? Maybe it's on the curriculum, or maybe like, you know, can we go over it again? Like maybe you want to talk about deep learning again because it's relevant to your capstone. We can even make part of like the study group office hours as like more of a lecture base if that's something that you guys want. But just have to let me know. And this is where I'm really flexible with however you guys want to use the office hours. Okay. Does that make sense to people? Okay, cool. I see nods. Awesome. So yeah, my big thing is just like your hardest part is going to be not the project itself, I feel, but actually like just that month and a half worth essentially of like working on a project. So you can kind of imagine. And so if you look through the section for the README that describes the project, I've kind of mentioned this already a couple of times at some points probably, but your projects have been kind of like building up a portfolio, right? It's kind of like your thing to say, hey, like I didn't just like learn the data science, I didn't just like read a book, I can actually show you what I've done, right? And your capstone's kind of like the go-to project. When interviewer or recruiter says, hey, tell me about a data science project you have. That first project that you say, oh, well, I've done this, that should be your capstone. So that kind of gives a framework of a little bit of like what your capstone is supposed to be, right? So it's the thing that you can basically start talking about and go into detail. If someone asks you a question about your capstone, you can more or less answer it. If someone says, why didn't you do it this way? You can say, well, I considered that way. Or, you know, like, oh, you know, I did it this way because of these reasons. Like you can give a reasonable answer to it. And that's the kind of level you want your capstone to be at. Now, one thing your capstone doesn't need to be, it doesn't have to be some groundbreaking project that no one's ever done before and like you're going to get published and everything like that. You know, if you can do that, awesome, right? But it definitely isn't the thing that you have to do. Sometimes I think some people think a little too ambitiously, and just be realistic in the sense that you only have about a month and a half, right, to really put everything together. Other things you don't have to have in your capstone. So we just went over deep learning and NLP in Mod 6. You don't need to have NLP and deep learning in your capstone. Might it be beneficial for your specific problem? Yeah, sure. But you don't, it's not a requirement in there. So don't try to shoehorn NLP in there just because you're like, oh, I really need to do this because we learned in Mod 6. This is much more open than what the other projects are. And this is kind of like where I've might even mentioned to a couple of you individually, is that I kind of view the Mod 5 project that we just finished with machine learning it's kind of like a baby capstone, and this is kind of like your full capstone. So Mod 5 project, you got to pick your own data set. You got to pick basically what is the business stakeholder problem, right? And then kind of solving for that. Capstone basically is kind of showing you like you want to do the full data science process. So you will want to get, I think even the Capstone project README says something like, don't use like ready-made data sets. The main focus on that is like, you don't want to pick a data set that just doesn't show off your skills. You don't want something that's already basically pre-made and like, it's going to not really stand out because like, for example, someone asks you and like, your recruiter or whatever says, oh, like tell me about your data science project, you talk about it. It's like, oh, like what was the data? It's like, oh, well, it was already collected from like Kaggle. And it's like, that's fine. But if you can kind of like talk about some nuances, even if it's like, oh, I have to do this cleaning or like I combine data sets together, but there's some differences and things like that. Those are really great things to be able to talk about. You don't need to have scraping, but if you're going to do scraping, be ready for that. It's like, okay, I'm going to take some time to actually scrape the data, put it together. Make sure, I would say, is that your overall thing is that you want to make sure your project is showing, one, your skills, but two, also showing that you can take an idea and solve, like, maybe solve's not the right word, but like gain insight from a problem. So you should really think in those kind of terms. And that's what's going to show off like a lot about like what you are like as a data scientist. Because I'll tell you, there's a lot of people who are very, very smart, but just have a real hard time, like they just haven't had this practice of taking like, it's like, oh, they can do, they can do all the machine learning parts, they can do the analysis, but they really can't tell you what that means beyond just like what they found. And this is where like, the data scientist is really like kind of like the communicator of like between like the technical and the non-technical. So really kind of think about your stakeholder problems like that. And this is where there's a couple pathways, if you already have some ideas in your head, that's awesome. And this is where I'd suggest 2 different ways you can approach this capstone idea project, because it's really up to you. One is to think of it as like, if you know what specific industry you want to go to, like, like, oh, I want to work for this company or this industry, it might be beneficial to find a project that will be kind of at least related to that industry. Okay, that can be really helpful. However, that's not necessary. So one's like, maybe you don't know exactly what industry you want. It's like, I know I like data science, but I don't really know exactly what industry I would go for. Or maybe you don't really care too much. You're like very open to a bunch of ideas. You can, I would say you can and should pick a project that you feel passionate about. And I say passionate, meaning that you will be interested in doing it. Not a project where you're just like, oh, this is so boring. Like why did I pick this project? Like, oh, I don't really care at all. If you can pick something that you're at least, and I say passionate, I don't mean like he's like, I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. This is my life, kind of deal. But something that you're interested in, that shows so much more in an interview and when someone's talking to you about the project versus like, I would rather have someone who has a project that they're interested in and you can hear that interest that's not relevant to whatever the job they're doing versus someone who has a really relevant project that could be maybe even folded directly into, this thing, but like looks so like bored by their own project. And like, that's the kind of distinction. So even if you know what industry it is and you're just like, I can't get like, you just can't find a project that just really speaks to you. Like, it just like, oh, this feels like really bland. Like you're just going through the motions. You might want to think about picking a different project. And what's nice is that, again, this project's not so much about like trying to make something that's completely new and groundbreaking. It's really to show your skills. So really almost any project you'll do likely will show multiple parts of your skills and like what your, overall process looks like. Okay, does that all make sense to everyone? Yeah, any thoughts or questions that kind of go through your head right now? Yeah. Okay, that's cool.
See, I've seen in the in the project that it has to be supervised supervised learning project, right? But it says also that it can be like a mix of supervised and unsupervised, right? Is that right? Or what could you recommend?
Yeah, so I would say is that supervised learning is likely going to be clear as a project of going from like, here's the problem, here's my business question, you know, how do I solve this? But I will say, like, I personally say, if you find a problem and you're like, you know what, this is more of an unsupervised learning problem, go for it. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. I think the biggest thing is just knowing what steps you'll have to take, and really showing that. On the extreme end of this, I haven't had any specific student do this, but I do know, like my own students, from other instructors, they would actually focus more on building a data dashboard, and that was a big part of like their project, is like building up this dashboard, which they meant to actually took a lot of time learning how to do data dashboards. Like I think they specifically use Flask, which is a Python package to build like dashboards and stuff like this. But it meant they had to teach themselves a lot of extra stuff that we in the curriculum don't necessarily show or talk about. But the important part is really, like, again, like I personally, like, am so flexible. Like, you know, you should go through me, like make sure we check, you know, what your project is before you start diving right into it. But I am so flexible in trying to make whatever sounds interesting to you into a project that, you know, I would say fulfills the requirements for the capstone. But really, in my mind, what fulfills the requirements for the capstone is what you can take out of this after you graduate and bring this over to like a job interview and everything. Does that answer your question, Bardo? Like, does that kind of clarify a little
So
more?
can you share actually like more specifically, like some examples of you know, what's
Yeah,
people
like what they've done, like kind of
yeah,
like overall.
yeah.
Yes. So one problem, so I had a student who actually used to be a dentist, or at least went to dentistry school. And what they did, they found images, like, so this isn't something they collected themselves. It was already kind of pre-collected, but they took images of or X-ray images, and they used CNNs, convolutional neural nets, right, to basically make classification on saying, I think it was disease, if I remember right, like what diseases this person possibly had. And they were expanding this out, saying, well, these are kind of like, they're familiar with X-ray, so they kind of say, this is how expensive this would be. I think the data set also had MRI data as well, but they were kind of saying, you know, how MRI data is a lot harder to get versus X-rays and things like this. And they were able to go beyond just saying, oh, I built a classifier that can say, you know, this person has this disease or not, and say, oh, these are the ways you can actually use this model, you know. And in the end, the model itself wasn't like the best model. Like, I think it's something like, it was like 65% or 70% accurate, but they were saying, you know, the proof of concept of saying, oh, like, this is how this can be used. And these are the ways, you know, like, essentially, like, you know, using his own little bit of domain knowledge of saying, oh, this is how you can use this, and this is how, like, where it's more expensive or more easily accessible, or how we can get more data. And I think he combined like two different data sets. So that's one project. Another person, also a convolution neural net, that's one that just pops in my head, is they basically did something where they took traffic signs and basically classifying like what kind of traffic sign it was. And so their goal, basically, they actually really wanted to work with like a self-driving car, like, you know, company. Like, that's something that they really, really wanted to do. So they're like, I really want to make sure like I can show like the basis of this. And, you know, it wasn't like, again, like, it wasn't a groundbreaking project, but it was something that they could relate, and they could talk in full detail about like the nuances, like where this data comes from. They had to figure out how to, what's it called? Like, normalize the data set, right? They had to do data augmentation. They had to talk about like where this is useful, where it's not useful, and things like that. And then I'm trying to think of a third one. So there's one that was a natural language processing. It's a natural language processing problem. And this one was, they took reviews from, I think it was Amazon. If it wasn't Amazon, it was something like that, like an online shopping. And they basically were using natural language processing to see if they could determine if this review was helpful or not. And so they had to go through this part and do different models and kind of show a little bit of like what this looks like. And then they expanded out further, saying, oh, like, you know, we did this for this specific, you know, store, let's say it's Amazon, and said, but we can take this and apply this maybe outside of Amazon, and maybe a specific to like, you know, reviews for, you know, like for your other industry. So I think they were talking about, I'm trying to remember specifically, I think they were talking about like Gap or something like that, like had a review section, and that they were trying to use that kind of like equivalent. They were talked about, they used some samples from, they Webscraped just a little bit as a sample of saying, oh, now we can transfer learn this process over to this company. So those are some ideas.
So in the example of the stop or the different traffic signs, where would you find data like that? Did they just web scrape for different images?
Yeah, so they actually found something that was from, I think it was originally from Kaggle, or at least that's where they originally found that data set. And then it was more or less raw images. So they had to, let's see here, like it was labeled already. That's why it was a supervised learning. But they still had to, like, it wasn't the best picture. So they had to scale all the pictures down to the right size and everything like this. When we talk about CNNs, CNNs have to have the same sized photo. Otherwise, you can't do any, work on it. But that was something that he had to do. So it was, in that case, that was a much cleaner data set than maybe something like the NLP one where they have to do a lot of, processing and stuff like that. But yeah, and I would say, like, this is where I think the curriculum says, like, oh, don't use it as, yeah, I'm looking at it right now. No off-the-shelf data sets.
Right. I was going to ask, I mean, if we didn't do web scraping, would you recommend that we kind of find like dirtier data and maybe several different data sets that we are combining, like you said, to show off skills instead of just using some, I guess, data set that is already pretty cleaned up?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say like, oh, this data set is too clean, I shouldn't use it. It'd be much more saying, what is your, like kind of like the meta goal here, like of saying like, you want to showcase your abilities. If scraping isn't a huge part of something that you want to like be able to essentially really show off, I wouldn't say try to do web scraping just to like make that a bigger part. I think, to be quite honest, the bigger part like of this whole project is not necessarily each individual step, but saying the overall, like, can you say, here's the problem, what did you do to try to solve this problem? And I think that's a better phrase. The opposite of this is what I think we kind of did more in Mod 5, where it's like, find a data set and then find the problem for that data set. I think you should try to do the reverse. It's like, try to find the problem that you're interested in and see what you can do to solve that problem. It might just be like you find data sets that are already relatively clean, and other times you're like, you know what, I have to do some web scraping, and maybe supplement your data set with something that was web scraped. I would say is that if you find something that's pretty clean, like even on Kaggle, I would suggest like trying to use multiple data sets if possible. But it isn't necessary. And I think the main thing the curriculum kind of mentions that is because there's a few, like it talks about like the Boston housing data set and the MNIST data set. There's also one on Kaggle, like the Titanic data set. It's like, these are so like such common data sets that it's almost like a joke to say, like, if you put on your resume and like no one even looks at it, because it's like, it's so overdone. So that's kind of the thing you want to avoid, is basically doing just something that a reiteration of someone else's project. Does that make more sense, Thomas? Okay, cool.
I have a question too.
Yeah.
Regarding picking the project. I learn better on the projects. That's when I really learn what I'm doing. So my idea was to kind of do the opposite, to decide what I want to learn better, and then try to find a project that would require those things. Like, we've done web scraping a long time ago, and I can't say I can do that well as of now. So that's something I want to practice more and learn better. So I would want something that, okay, I want a project that I need to do web scraping for it. And other things like that, does that make sense, to first decide what tools I want to have to work with and then try to come up with a problem that requires those tools?
Yeah, I would say that would be a fine thing to kind of a way of approaching it. It's not the thing I would recommend to everyone to immediately do it that way. I would say be careful with, especially like you were saying, like doing a project to kind of like help you like solidify that learning that you've done already. Just because you can get into that hole of like, oh, I can't do any of this stuff until I relearn it or learn something new. And you don't want to take all of the time to do like the learning portion to do the project, right? And so one thing I'll say to this is that even though this is our capstone, this would be the kind of like the mark of like the end of your, the course right here through Flatiron. There's no reason why you can't ever do other projects after this point, right? So, you know, if there is something you're like, oh, you know, there's these different things I want to do, and like, you know what, I don't know if I could put this all together in one capstone. It just seems like a little too much. You can definitely say, well, let me make like, you know, I have like, it's funny, I have like a list of notes or list of projects that I want to do. You know, I was like, oh, like I'll have an idea and like, oh, you know, let me do this project later and stuff like that. So that's always a good thing to do too. The biggest thing is just keeping it reasonable. Like just knowing that you have about, you know, about 6-ish weeks to not just, you know, do the project, but also, you know, the write-up, you know, your presentation, you know, being able to practice that. That's the kind of like, what's it called? Like timeline that you want to do. And if you think of it this way too, the projects that we've been doing are like scheduled for about a 2-week period. The capstone is scheduled for about a 6-week period. So it's like about a 3 times length of the expected project. And you don't want to take too much time out over, you know, making it too intense, if that makes sense. But yeah.
I feel the exact same way, Giovanna, that I feel like I really don't learn anything until I do the project. Like, or at least I don't retain anything until I do the project. So I kind of feel the same way, but you know, like if I wanted to use neural networks in the capstone, I feel like I could still think of a problem first and then incorporate neural networks to solve the problem, right? Like, would you agree, Victor, that you could still do it both ways?
Oh, yeah.
You can think about the problem first, but still incorporate those skills like using web scraping, using the stuff you learned in Mod 6 or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's definitely seems useful. Like I kind of imagine like, you know, what Thomas, you were saying, and Giovanna, what you're saying is like, if I were kind of approaching in this way, I would maybe like list the, like on one, like part, like I would take a piece of paper, split my paper in half and say, you know, on the right side are the different topics I want to make sure I know how to do, or I would like to apply this project. And then on the left side, write project ideas and then say which project ideas would actually incorporate those different topics and then kind of judge off that. So like maybe it's like, oh, I have this project idea, but it's only going to use like one of these 4 different things I really want to make sure I do, you know, in my project. And then you can kind of judge off of that. I don't see any problem with that at all. And it can even go the other way where not even just like using it to learn, but also kind of like using it to kind of like, you know, your showcase, like saying, oh, this is what I've done.
What % of students have you had actually use web scraping for the capstone? Is it common?
To be honest, I think maybe like maybe 1 in 5 have used kind of like web scraping. Like it depends what you do too, because like some web scraping is a lot easier. Like I had a few students use Twitter data, and the Twitter API is relatively easy to scrape data. But I did have one student try to actually scrape a website, and it was just becoming so much of a bloated thing that they realized early on, they're like, this isn't a good project, or this isn't the way I need to approach this project, which was good. That was a good realization that they're like, you know what, just realistically for the amount of time, it's just not going to work out. So I think I've told my story about like the Olympics data set that I had before, where I tried scraping the Olympics website, and then literally I had kind of like already, I'm like, oh cool, I'll go ahead and run this tomorrow, because it was like a pretty big, you know, like scraper. And then literally, I can't make this stuff up. Literally the next day, the website format changed. So those things can happen sometimes. And, you know, this is where you want to have something, that's probably unlikely, but like, you know, keeping something in reasonable amount of time and just knowing that there's a whole bunch of ways you can do the same stuff. Yeah.
I mean, one thing I'll say is that, I mean, I don't have a lot of experience, but I've had like a few data science interviews, and it seems like people are not as concerned with web scraping or data collection as they are with the actual analysis. Like, it seems like it's just like nice to have. It doesn't seem, at least from what I've seen, it doesn't seem like it's their focus.
Yeah, I think that's a really like common thing. Like, I think it obviously depends a little bit on industry, maybe a little bit depends on the position, but I would say web scraping, it's not as common because it's closer to the data acquisition side, where if you kind of think of it this way, like as a data scientist, you're a hot commodity. You're like, this is someone who's really useful, can give us a lot of insight. If we spend them a lot of time just getting data necessarily, it's not the best use of the time necessarily. So that's kind of like, I think there's a lot more value. Like I think I've talked about this, like data science is kind of evolving because it's a pretty new industry. And my guess is that we're going to start getting more closer to like an analysis or like an analyst data scientist, which sounds redundant because data analysts already exist, but like more of the analysis for a data scientist and more of like the prediction for a data science, and maybe closer to kind of like a data science / data engineer kind of position. We're already seeing that with data engineering, where data engineering is taking up more of that kind of like process that a data scientist used to have to do themselves. And now it's like, oh, we have a data engineer to do this stuff. But yeah, I wouldn't stress out specifically saying, oh, I need to put web scraping in here, unless it's something that you know for like either a company you've talked to or you've looked at, or an industry that you know that data scraping is going to be a big deal for what you're going to do. Cool. It's not a bad skill to throw in there too. Like it's one of those things that's like, you're just more versatile, right? But it's not something you have to say, oh, I need to put in this there. Otherwise, like, I won't get a job. No, yeah. Anything else you guys are thinking about then about this black zone? Okay.
One other thing I was thinking about is I just pulled up the Capstone page and I see the example of the student who did the Twitter project I think you were talking about. I don't know if this is the same one, the tweet.
Not my student, but yeah, I see it.
Oh, not yours. Okay. Is there a place that we can see like other examples? I haven't even looked at this one yet, but I think it's always helpful to see kind of what other students have done just to get ideas.
I think someone else asked me about this and I said, I should look more into it. And then it kind of just died away. I'm going to ask more like instructors and stuff if we have like a set of like, I don't think to like be upfront, we don't currently have like a specific like, oh, here's a bunch of capstones that we've seen, other instructors have seen, and these are ones to show off. But I'll try to get that. I'll maybe ask around a little bit and say, maybe you have some past capstones that people can share. Yeah, sounds good. Yeah. Sorry, I was just kind of scrolling through. I'm on the wrong page. Okay. But yeah, I would say if you go through, one thing I'll mention about like this kind of like the data acquisition can be kind of finicky, right? So one's like, like your website could change the next day because you try scraping it and stuff like that. But I actually had a student, they were using Twitter. This was just this year. They're still working on their capstone actually right now. But they were using the Twitter API, and they, I guess there's a process. I don't remember the process. I had the developer Twitter for a while. But they applied for the Twitter API, and then basically they started asking him a bunch of questions and stuff like this. And it seemed like it took her like about almost 3 weeks or 4 weeks where she actually got approved eventually. But it was taking like a week before they were kind of just asking a bunch of questions back and forth kind of deal. And she said, you know what, never mind. Like, never mind. I'm not going to use Twitter. I'm just going to use a data set that already exists that is a Twitter data set. And they're able to do that project. So not that sometimes your things can change. It was kind of a weird case. I think it's something recent to do with how Twitter does their API vetting process. I think probably because of like the 2020 election and the concern about the 2016 election. And this student had asked, or when they asked, what are you going to do this for? It's like, well, for a school project about the election. And I think that kind of set off some signals at Twitter, and they were like asking a whole bunch of questions. Like they were asking like, who is your instructor name? What's the organization? All these different things. And ironically, another student about the same time applied for the Twitter API about the next day, but didn't mention anything. So just kind of know weird things can happen like that. So yeah, just be flexible for sure. Okay. Cool. Anything else that you guys kind of overall just thinking right now? Okay. Cool, yeah.
I just want to say that the Reddit data set, I don't know, you probably already said it before, but like every day there's like really interesting stuff.
Yeah.
That's put on there as far as where to look. And some of it isn't like, it's not necessarily like Kaggle style data sets. Like some of it you do have to do like some acquisition stuff to get it into a good clean version.
Yeah, and that'll be a good practice. would say that you're talking about the subreddit, right? For
The
data
subreddit,
sets.
yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good one too. Like it's kind of fun to see like a little bit of like what people have. Definitely like, especially if you're like really stuck, you're like, I don't know what kind of idea like to do. Check that out. One of my favorite things just to like randomly go on sometimes is the Google dataset search engine. Because you can just like, oh, I say, oh, I want to see about bike data, and you can search for things. You're like, oh, look, here's a bunch of bike data stuff, and you can pull that through. So I think the biggest, like, again, the biggest thing is like when you get your project together is being able to say, what was your project, like, what was the business reason, what was the point of doing this project, and being able to say you had a reason and being able to find the relevant data and then doing the subsequent analysis and prediction. Okay. Cool. Yeah, so I don't know. I always get really excited about these ones because I think everyone does some really interesting stuff. And yeah, cool. So any last questions, any last thoughts? I'll stop the recording if there's anything else.
We use the same guidelines as our last project, pretty much. So like,
yeah, the size you're talking about?
I mean, yeah, I guess that was the, yeah.
Yeah, I think if you use that guideline for like
the
this
subjects too, like to stay away from certain ones.
Yeah, I think though this is a little more flexible where like if you had a data set where you're like, I kind of stayed away with it because, like Victor of the curriculum kind of like suggested not to go towards it. This is where you can take a little more time to like do data acquisition, stuff like that. So I would say a lot more is on the table, but I'd still be wary, especially of domain specific data sets, of like, science data sets and stuff like that, just because some of that can get some kind of just a lot of extra like technical knowledge beyond, the data itself. But yeah, and this is where I will say like, kind of looking forward, I don't have like a firm deadline of like, when this should be, but I would say the last, like, well, I guess like by the end of this month is to have a project idea and a possible data set. So we can kind of say, yes, go ahead and go for it. So that's something that, we'll talk about in, our one-on-ones. We can even talk about study groups and stuff like that. Yes, okay. But excuse me, I would make sure, don't like, if you was like, oh, I want to do this project, definitely make sure you check it by with me first before you start diving really deep into it. Just make sure like I could give you some advice or just kind of do a quick approval. Okay. Cool, yeah. Awesome. So any other last things before I guess stop recording here? Pretty good. Okay. I'll go ahead and stop recording that way people can have this for later.